So my name's Lisa-Raine and I work on a programme funded by the Home Office, which probably makes me one of the less popular people in the building today. But I'm going to spend the next 10 minutes or so talking to you about why I believe the unholy alliance of grassroots and government is vital in tackling an ever complex and diverse picture of extremisms in the UK. So I'm going to start by telling two very brief stories. The first is a story of a borough, a district in London facing significant challenges. This is one of the most densely populated boroughs in London and is ranked 11th most deprived in the UK. Child poverty is extremely high, with 37% of children living in poverty, despite this being an area of significant affluence. Inequality is stark. Crime is higher here in comparison to similar boroughs, and the borough has a reputation for youth violence. Hate crime in this borough has one of the highest levels in London, with particularly concerning levels of racism, Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, homophobia and transphobia. A number of extremist groups have a footprint in or around the borough, and the borough in the past has been a target for the far right, the far left, and religiously linked extremism. This borough often hits the news headlines for all the wrong reasons, for inequality, for crime, and extremism. Let's contrast this with the second story. This story is focused on a borough which has great potential, a district of London that is vibrant and full of innovation and promise. The borough is young, with a quarter of the population under 20, and youth communities lead the way in the arts, music, sports, social justice, and high educational outcomes. This borough is incredibly diverse, with communities represented from across the world living together in peace. 90% of residents say they get on well with neighbours from around the world. There are key Abrahamic faith communities in this borough, with Orthodox, conservative, Jewish, Muslim and Christian communities working together to develop interfaith understanding and partnership. Crime is falling in this borough, with the local authority and police force partnering with local communities to address community tensions as they arise. Residents are encouraged to design and lead their own programmes to build community resilience against a broad range of extremisms. This borough has been voted one of the happiest boroughs in London, and often hits the headlines for news of community partnerships, social action projects, and peace building. So what underlies the stark difference between these two contrasting stories? One a story of challenge, concern, and extremisms, the other a story of vibrant diversity, of achievement and community resilience. These stories are in fact both about the same borough of London. This is the borough where we're sitting at the moment, where I'm standing. This is the borough of Hackney, where I live and work. Welcome to Hackney. The two different stories I've shared about Hackney are both true, and they're both true currently, but they underline two different approaches that I've seen in the approach to challenging extremism. One approach many of us sadly will have seen over the years is what I might call a deficit-based approach, an approach that begins as a starting point with the perceived problems in any community, the perceived deficiencies of poverty, low educational outcomes, crime and extremism. This kind of approach, in my personal opinion, is where a number of previous central and local government partnerships with grassroots communities may have failed. But the second is an approach that we might call an asset-based community approach, an approach that begins with the strengths, the skills, and the experiences of grassroots communities, working together in partnership to understand needs and vulnerabilities, to identify opportunities, and to develop collaborative resilience. This is an approach where I think grassroots and government can work effectively in partnership to tackle a range of extremisms. So what is the UK counter-extremism programme? The programme looks at the wider harms of extremisms in society. I'm not going to talk through them all, but there are some on the screen for you. Everything from segregation and reduced cohesion, through to very definite extremist speakers, events and marches, moving towards radicalisation and terrorism, but really that sits specifically within the UK Prevent programme that you may have heard of. These are two different programmes that work distinctly, but at times in a complementary manner together. Prevent working more with those at direct risk of radicalisation to violent extremism. The counter-extremism programme looking much more at broader harms in society, some linked to terrorism, but some that won't ever be linked to terrorism, but are divisive and undermining of community stability. There are some ways we work together, for example, looking at the far right. Most of the far right space, sadly, is not illegal, and would sit more in the counter-extremism department, but we're starting to work a little bit more closely together because we're seeing increased violent expressions of the far right, so that would sit more in the prevent territory, so that's sort of how we work together. So looking at the counter-extremism programme in Hackney, just to review, a snapshot of some of the assets of Hackney then. Incredibly diverse borough, communities from all continents, good level of cohesion as reported by residents, a really strong voluntary grassroots community sector, leading frontline services and community cohesion and resilience programmes. Strong faith communities in Hackney, particularly strong representation from all the three Abrahamic faiths. We have a number of smaller representations from other faiths, but it's a borough where the three Abrahamic faiths are strong in number and work well together. Hackney started the first Muslim-Jewish forum in the country. Also has a strong Jewish Christian forum and an interfaith forum as well, which includes, it's a wider faith forum, so it includes also those from a humanist approach, and we have a non-religious church in our borough that joined that faith forum as well. We have a strong youth culture in the borough, as I mentioned, and some really good schemes in housing, environmental sustainability and education. So what are some of the challenges that make up that full picture of Hackney? What does our counter-extremism profile look like in Hackney? The major concern with extremism, as I'm sure you'll be aware in the UK at the moment, is the growth of the far right. We don't have a far right presence in Hackney. It's traditionally a very left-leaning borough. The far right don't have a presence there. But far right narratives still have an impact, particularly with young people. A recent survey with a group of young people from migrant backgrounds that we worked on together showed a significant prejudice against refugees and those from European origins. That is not Hackney, that's never been Hackney, but interestingly, those national sort of headlines, the national rhetoric, still feeds down into a quite diverse borough. We have a bit of a history of the far left in Hackney. We're often used for national anti-fascist meetings, but in recent years, those meetings have been peaceful and have caused no concern. What we do have is a strong prevalence of hate crime. That's partly because our police work with communities and record hate crime well, but there's no undermining the fact that we have significantly high levels of anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, and as I've said recently, sadly, a real growth in homophobia and transphobia as well. Much of that comes through people moving through the borough, particularly we have a strong nighttime economy, but some of that comes from local community tensions as well. We have very localised tensions in Hackney that don't necessarily follow the picture, but I think occur in all communities. For example, tensions between our Kurdish-Turkish communities, which has been tied up with some extremism in the past. Also localised tensions around schools, around community halls, generally around a grappling for resources, where resources are low and communities perhaps haven't had that direct relationship where they get to know each other, and there seems that communities are in competition with each other. We've also recently had some very challenging Hebrew Israelite hate preaching in the borough. I think hatred of all forms is on the rise in the UK. We're in an increasingly polarised environment where we might say there's a permission for hatred. We see hatred in national newslands, national headlines. We see prominent public figures speaking in a hateful manner, and it seems to just give a permission to groups. So we have a Hebrew Israelite group who've been particularly anti-Semitic and homophobic in the borough, but they're also misogynistic, Islamophobic, and kind of anti-Christian if you're the type of Christian that they don't agree with. And then we have some history of religiously linked extremism, a footprint of some groups such as ALM in the borough, but that's not a concern at the moment. Our mosques and our Muslim communities have worked incredibly hard to safeguard our borough from that. I feel like they've had to work too hard, but they haven't, and that we have good partnerships of critical friendship. Not everyone will be supportive of the Home Office, of course. We're not, I'm not personally supportive of everything that has been managed through the Home Office, particularly in Hackney. We have challenges with the Windrush generation. But there's a really important stance of critical friendship where we remain in dialogue together, and there's an openness in that space and dialogue. So to sort of conclude quickly, I'm going to file through some sort of strengths and weaknesses that I've identified. We might want to come back to these in questions if any of a particular interest. So the strength, I believe, of the CE, government CE programme is that we are all employed as local coordinators. So 40 communities across the UK have someone in my role, which is a local community coordinator. We're employed by the local government, and our programmes are locally designed, and where they're designed well, they're designed with grassroots groups and local communities. There is a challenge to local government through having this role to not avoid difficult conversations. It's very easy, I think, for local governments to do the popular political work of cohesion, but sometimes more difficult to just dig a little bit under the surface and have those difficult conversations that need to be had. And having this role and this programme within local government really helps that. Active communication and influence, both ways. So yes, the Home Office can filter through messages they have, but the key strength of the programme that I've seen is local communities communicating back to central government on changes that they need to see in policy. Hackney communities have influenced a change around places of worship security funding, so that community centres that are vulnerable, so faith-based community centres, are included in funding. They're currently working with the Home Office to shape policy around disrupting of extremist events and also to understand the nuances of some areas like harmful cultural practices. So that dual conversation going both ways is really important. Funding. Not everybody wants to take Home Office funding, and I will work with the group regardless of whether they will take Home Office funding or not, but there's no question that central government funding through the Building Stronger Britain Together, BSBT programme, and also through places of worship has provided local groups with funding to lead projects they wouldn't have been able to lead otherwise, and I'll tell you about some of those as we close. And national learning and best practice. I sit on a group called the Special Interest Group for Countering Extremism that looks at themes of extremism across the UK, looks at horizon scanning, so we can really learn best practice across the UK. So I learn what my colleagues in the north are doing to disrupt far-right marches and to respond there. I learn about faith approaches across the country. It's a really good way of looking at best practice. So there are some potential pitfalls. Going back to where I started, starting with a deficit approach doesn't work. And we all need to guard against that in all the work we do, whether that's central government, local government, or professionals and volunteers within the community. We need to make sure that we're starting with the assets of our community and amplifying those. We need to be careful through the work that we do not to amplify extremist narratives. Classic example, Katie Hopkins tweets something terrible on social media. Hundreds of people retweet her saying how awful it is. That narrative is spread. And so we need to really creatively think about positive counter-narratives rather than the amplification of extremist narratives. And that can be a danger on local level. I've seen that happen. And so what we tend to do is work very closely with communities. You may have heard of a horrible hate campaign called the Punish Muslim Day letter that was distributed across the UK. Specifically, communities in Hackney decided they did not want to respond to that in any shape or manner. And actually, a week later, we had a community solidarity event that was not linked to that. So we produced a positive outcome that didn't amplify the message of extremism, and locally that worked really well for us. There is an issue with racial and religious profiling. I see this in local communities. This is what extremism wants. Just to give you an example, obviously Jewish communities in Hackney have been very concerned recently about the attacks that took place in New York that were linked to the Hebrew Israelite movement. And we've seen some racial profiling both ways on a very local level between Jewish communities and black communities in Hackney. And we need to guard very carefully against that within the thinking of extremism. The same with the far right and Islamophobia as well, just making sure that communities are in constant dialogue and that we don't get into an issue of them and us. That can happen in work as much as it can within extremism, so we guard very carefully against that. Community expectations are not met. Communities need a lot. The government are not meeting expectations, so there's a difficulty of that one's ongoing. And also, there's always the risk of change in central government approach. We don't actually know what's happening with this programme for the following year yet. New change of leadership, our funding isn't approved beyond April. So there's some really good work that's been done, but actually it's always on a kind of contractual year-by-year basis. So there's a lack of stability there somewhat. So then what's happened in Hackney, just to finish off, some good news stories. So Hackney have worked with BSBT Home Office funding, but also with funding from a whole range of sources that you'll know, such as Near Neighbours. For those working in London, we work a lot with MOPAC, a lot of trusts and foundations, and also a lot of voluntary initiatives as well. We've developed community arts approaches, community sports approaches, really good group on the top left there, Salam Peace, they run an Eid Cup every year, bringing young people together from all faiths and none in the borough. They also do really excellent prison work around those who are at risk of radicalisation in prisons. We've got brilliant board games approaches, group in the top middle. Universal Board Games have recently worked with government funding to produce a card game working with local faith and secular schools about the experience that young people have of hate crime in the borough and the potential responses. And then young people, there's developed a really beautiful card game, which I'd love to have here, but don't have a copy to hand. And that goes in then to youth groups around the borough and to schools around the borough so that young people can play an open dialogue around hate crime and the potential responses. We have women's approaches, such as Xenia, bottom middle, which are a women's solidarity and friendship group. Interfaith initiatives, bottom left, is our Eid Street Party last year. Educational programmes, African Community School, bottom right. That was the school I talked about. They're a supplementary school for all faiths and none that work with migrant families at the weekend. And that was the school where, amongst migrant families, we found these really interesting prejudices. So we've been able to work with young people there to develop a model of looking at common values and solidarity to counter some of those narratives that we've heard. And that's now going to be rolled out for other groups in the borough. So that's a bit of a picture of Hackney. And all of these programmes are key. They start with an asset-based community approach. They enable communities to lead development of local resilience. They humanise the other by bringing communities together to build understanding, and they collaboratively address needs identified in community. So let us all, whether grassroots or government, together be the leaders that choose to speak the stories of hope and transformative action, and that build resilience again together against extremism in all its unusual forms. Thank you.
Thank you.